Are you sure? That's the last thing I said before it started. My name is Marcus Wren. I'm 44, and for 22 years the only people who used my rank meant it with their whole chest. Here on Larkspur Lane, in the quiet cul-de-sacs of Cedar Ridge, I was just the guy at the end of the street who mowed his own lawn and drove a dented F-150. I liked it that way. Nobody looked at me twice. We moved there in June, after my son Ethan finished 9th grade, chasing the one thing 20 years in the Rangers teaches you to crave: quiet. Next door lived Richard Coleman, a real estate developer who'd built half the shopping centers on the east side of the county and never let anyone forget it. His son Brandon was 22, home from a dropped-out semester, deep into an amateur MMA career, a black belt earned suspiciously fast, 12,000 followers, a highlight reel that thumped out of his garage every afternoon. I noticed him before he noticed me. Men like Brandon are too busy being watched to watch back. He revved his motorcycle under our window at 6 a.m. He took 2 mailbox spots like they were deeded to him. I watched him shoulder check a delivery driver half his size for blocking a sidewalk 4 seconds too long. Nobody said anything. That's Cedar Ridge. Polite until politeness costs something. I ran every morning at 5:30. Old habit. When the street still belonged to me. Brandon caught me once and told his buddy, loud enough to be heard, that I didn't look like I could survive one round. I didn't break stride. There's a restraint you learn in this life that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing not to prove it to strangers. I understood him, honestly. Boys raised on money and mirrors who confuse aggression with confidence because nobody ever taught them different. His father certainly wasn't going to. Richard was cordial to me the way wealthy men are cordial to people they've already decided don't matter. Handshake, joke about the market, eyes already moving on. What I didn't see coming was how fast Brandon's attention would drift from me to Ethan. My son was 15 that summer, quiet in the way kids get when they've moved too many times to get attached to anything. He didn't know anything about combatives. He knew about video games and a skateboard he was saving for. It started small. Brandon would drive slow past the basketball game the neighborhood kids ran, revving his engine just enough to scatter them, parking sideways across their court like he owned the asphalt. Once, twice, carelessness. By the 4th time, it was a message. Then it got personal. I came home from a brutal video conference and found Ethan on the front steps, still in that particular way that told me something was eating at him. Brandon had called him Mommy's little soldier in front of everyone, except it wasn't his mother he'd invoked. It was me, and the joke landed the same. Everybody laughed. I felt something old and tight in my stomach, kept my voice level, because that's always been the job, not the absence of anger, but the discipline not to let it drive. Don't fight people desperate to prove something, I told him. That hunger's bottomless. You can't satisfy it with a reaction. You just feed it. He nodded. 15 doesn't run on wisdom. 10 days later I heard raised voices outside and found Ethan's bike on its side in the street, front wheel spinning, Brandon filming and grinning at his phone. Say it again, he was telling Ethan for the camera. I walked over at a measured pace. Chaos is exactly what an aggressor wants, because it confirms he's under your skin. Pick up the bike, I said. Or what? He answered. I just looked at him the way you look at a threat assessment, cataloging, no heat. His eyes flickered, half a second of something involuntary. I've seen that flicker in men 3 times his size, right before they decide it's smarter to back down. Richard's Escalade pulled up before it resolved. He didn't ask if Ethan was okay. He looked at me in my gardening clothes and said, "You military people always think rank matters outside the base." I said nothing. I set the bike upright and walked it home, and Ethan asked why I hadn't said anything. Because he wanted a reaction, I told him. I don't hand out what people demand, just by being loud. But that night I lay awake feeling the old current stir. This wasn't over. Boys like Brandon don't stop when you walk away. They stop when the world finally proves that walking away was never the same thing as being afraid. Labor Day, the whole street closes off for a block party. Brandon showed up a few beers in, pulled up his own highlight reel on somebody's phone, narrated his knockouts to a small humoring crowd. Around 5 he called out, "Anybody here think they can beat me? Come on, I'll go easy." Silence. The exhausted kind, not the respectful kind. It seemed to bother him more than a challenge would have. His eyes landed on me by the drink table. "What about you, Colonel?" He crossed the pavement, unzipped a gym bag, and dropped a pair of gloves at my feet. The whole block went quiet enough to hear ice cracking in someone's lemonade. "Put your money where your mouth is." I looked at the gloves, then at him. "Are you sure?" Something flickered across his face again, buried fast under bravado. "Scared," he said, louder, for the crowd. I handed my watch to Mrs. Henderson and my phone to Ethan. "Stand behind the fence, whatever happens." He nodded, eyes wide. Richard stood near the front already filming, certain how this story ended. Brandon came at me exactly like I expected. Cage fighters close distance fast, aggression before technique. A looping right hand, more show than substance. I slipped it with a pivot of the hips. He spun back with a low kick. I stepped inside it instead of away, caught his arm in a drag that used his own momentum, swept his lead foot, put him down. He scrambled up, came again, faster, more real this time. I felt one punch graze my ear. Something in my chest went cold and calm, the exact stillness from the seconds before a breach. I stepped behind him, dropped my hips, took his base out before he registered I'd moved. He hit the pavement. I secured the arm, shifted to a controlled hold at his neck. Nothing meant to hurt, only to say this is finished when I decide it's finished. He tapped my forearm twice. I released him instantly. No extra second held to make a point. I never threw a single punch, the whole fight. That mattered to me. I pulled him to his feet and leaned in close enough that only he could hear. Winning isn't the same as humiliating someone. I had 100 chances to hurt you tonight and didn't take one. That was a choice. He nodded, something cracking open in his face that had nothing to do with the fight. I found Ethan behind the fence, put a hand on his shoulder, said let's go home. Behind us, Richard was already shouting for someone to call the police. "Assault," he kept saying. The cruisers came 20 minutes later. I told the officer plainly, Brandon challenged me publicly, threw the gloves himself, and I never struck him once. He looked skeptical, until 4 different phone videos surfaced from around the crowd, all telling the same story. No charges filed. The older officer pulled me aside on his way out. That was about as clean as I've ever seen someone handle a situation like that. Richard didn't let it go. He hired a private investigator, hunting for leverage. What it turned up instead was the truth. 22 years of service. Command experience most civilians had no frame of reference for. Instead of backing off, it seemed to embolden him. He started drafting formal letters to the Department of Defense, alleging conduct unbecoming an officer, hoping the mere threat would make me smaller. I didn't sweat it. I hadn't done anything wrong, and there was no honest inquiry that ended badly for me. The real question was what looking closely at Richard would turn up. The letter reached an old friend of mine, now a 3-star general, who told me later he'd laughed out loud reading it, a man mad that he'd lost a fight he started. The inquiry into my conduct closed within days, commending the restraint I'd shown. But inquiries generate their own momentum. Standard due diligence on a formal complainant turned up Richard's business background, falsified bid documents on municipal contracts tied to federal funding, shell subsidiaries built to dodge minority contractor requirements, payments to a zoning official dressed up as consulting fees. I want to be clear, I orchestrated none of it. I made no calls. What happened to Richard happened because he built his life on a foundation of dishonesty and invited official scrutiny into it at exactly the wrong moment. The Defense Contract Audit Agency got involved first, then the FBI, then the IRS. Within 6 weeks, Richard was the subject of 3 federal inquiries, his contracts frozen. Brandon's gym quietly suspended his membership. His sponsors dropped him within a week. The garage went quiet in the mornings for the first time since we'd moved in. I didn't feel triumph watching it unfold. I hadn't wanted this scale of consequence for him, but it hadn't really been about me. Richard's collapse had been years in the making before I ever moved onto Larkspur Lane. I was just the thread that, once pulled, unraveled what had already been fraying. By late November, there was a for sale sign crooked in the Coleman lawn. The bank foreclosed in December, legal fees having eaten through what was left once the contracts stayed frozen. They moved out on a gray Tuesday morning, and the street settled back into itself. Brandon came to my door the week before they left, alone, no phone, no audience. He looked younger than 22. "I should have listened to what you tried to tell me that day," he said. "The bike, the way I talked to you, all of it." I told him strength isn't measured by who you can beat. It's measured by who you choose not to hurt. He asked if he could apologize to Ethan. I called my son down, and the two of them stood on the porch and closed a door that had been open too long. It wasn't cinematic. It was just two people finally done with the noise. Cedar Ridge went back to being exactly what the listing promised. Quiet, in the way that only comes after a storm clears out. I still run at 5:30. Neighbors who used to look past me stop and wave now. Ethan made varsity soccer that spring. When someone tries to push him around, I notice he doesn't flinch anymore. He just watches, calm, unbothered. The same stillness I spent 20 years learning, passed down without either of us ever discussing it. I think about that season now, with something closer to gratitude than anger. It taught me again what I'd already learned once, somewhere much harder. Patience isn't passivity, and walking away isn't weakness. The people who mistake your restraint for fear are always the ones who eventually learn the hardest lesson of all. If this one found you at the right moment, tell me in the comments which part hit hardest. I read every one. And if you believe quiet strength always wins in the end, subscribe, because there are a lot more stories like this one coming.